What did the millionaire discover on his wedding night that would change his life forever? When the 42-year-old businessman approached his young 21-year-old wife, everyone thought they knew her true intentions. But what he discovered that night about her purity left him breathless. Tell me, where are you watching from? Subscribe to the channel and leave a like to discover this love story that defied all prejudices. The sun was setting over New York City, gilding the skyscrapers and transforming the Hudson River into a ribbon of liquid fire. In the bridal suite of the Plaza Hotel, Anthony Richards contemplated the reflection of his 42 years in the ornate mirror. His graying temples contrasted with his impeccable black suit, a symbol of a fortune built on decades of cold calculations and ruthless decisions. "Time doesn't erase scars, it merely covers them with a layer of dignity," he murmured, adjusting his tie with a gesture that had become mechanical after years of business meetings. A few rooms away, Claire Bennett, 21 years old, watched from the window as the city lights began to twinkle. Her simple lace wedding dress without the diamonds and pearls Anthony had wanted to offer her contrasted with the ostentatious luxury of the suite. She wore only her grandmother's silver brooch and the jasmine perfume from her childhood in Brooklyn. Her fingers absently caressed the small scar on her wrist, a souvenir of a summer when she had learned to carve wood with her father Frank. On this wedding night, when Anthony finally approached Claire, his hands were trembling. The room, bathed in the soft light of candles, smelled of lavender. Claire was sitting on the edge of the four-poster bed, her fingers intertwined on her knees, her dark brown eyes shining with something Anthony had never imagined finding again after 15 years of solitude: genuine hope. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice more fragile than the boards of directors he terrorized had ever heard. Claire looked up and smiled with that disarming sincerity that had won him over from their first meeting at the charity hospital. "No, Anthony, I'm not afraid of you. Perhaps we should ask instead if you're afraid of me." This simple phrase contained a truth so profound that Anthony felt his world waver. For in this marriage that all of New York labeled a financial arrangement, the aging millionaire and the young beauty from Brooklyn, lay a far more complex reality. It wasn't Claire who needed his fortune, but he who desperately needed her purity. The first month after the wedding, Anthony took Claire to the restaurant at the Rainbow Room high above Rockefeller Center. While white-gloved waiters bustled around them and the lights of New York stretched as far as the eye could see, he observed his young wife with the fascination of a man discovering a new species. "What do you think?" he asked, indicating with a broad gesture the sumptuous room and the breathtaking view. Claire delicately brought her champagne flute to her lips before responding. "It's magnificent, Anthony, but do you know what I find even more beautiful? The little cafes in Brooklyn where the servers call you by name, and where you can feel history in the walls." Anthony's eyes darkened imperceptibly. In his world, power was measured by the tables one could reserve, by the doors that opened at his name. "You don't like it," he stated, with a hint of accusation in his voice. Claire placed her hand on his, her slightly calloused fingers reminding Anthony that she had grown up working with her hands, helping her mother Sarah embroider silk scarves. "It's not that I don't like it, it's that I love you for reasons that have nothing to do with all this." In the car that took them back to their townhouse on the Upper East Side, Anthony remained silent, his forehead pressed against the tinted window. Claire respected this silence, instinctively understanding that he was struggling with demons that no fortune could exorcise. The next day, Claire received her first visit from Elizabeth, Anthony's eldest daughter, a brilliant law student at Columbia University, barely a year older than herself. The meeting took place in the grand salon with its gilded moldings, where the portraits of Anthony's ancestors, purchased at auction to give the illusion of lineage, looked down at the two young women with painted eyes of disdain. "I suppose congratulations are in order," Elizabeth said without extending her hand, her blue eyes, the same as Anthony's, scrutinizing Claire as an entomologist would examine an insect. "You've succeeded where so many others have failed." Claire poured tea into two fine china cups, her movements measured and graceful despite the palpable tension. "You believe I married your father for his money?" It wasn't a question, and the calm tone caught Elizabeth off guard. Anthony's daughter had prepared herself for passionate denials, not this quiet acceptance of her accusation. "Isn't that the case?" A 21-year age difference, a girl from Brooklyn without a penny to her name, a marriage after only 4 months. The scenario is rather transparent. Claire smiled. But this smile didn't reach her eyes. Your father has the same expression when he's angry, that slight tick at the corner of his mouth. It's fascinating how traits are passed down. Elizabeth flinched, disconcerted by this change of subject. Don't deflect the conversation. I'm not deflecting. I'm observing. Just as I observed your father cry in secret in Central Park, while holding a photo of his children when they were small. As I observed his kindness toward Mrs. Collins, who cleans his office. As I observed his loneliness, so deep it could swallow the Hudson. Elizabeth's cheeks flushed. You don't know him. Claire stood up, smoothed her simple blue dress, and looked at Elizabeth with unexpected compassion. You're right. I don't know him completely yet. But I want to know him. Just as I would like to know you, Charles and Michael, because you're his family, and now in a way you're also mine. When Elizabeth left, Claire felt the weight of this first obstacle. The whispers of New York would grow, she knew. The accusations would intensify. But what none of them yet understood was the quiet strength that had inhabited her heart since childhood. This conviction that true wealth had never resided in vaults or stock shares. A week later, Anthony summoned Claire to his study. The imposing room, with walls covered in leather-bound books and a massive mahogany desk, resembled a courtroom more than a workspace. Claire immediately noticed the presence of Mr. Lambert, the grey-templed lawyer whose reputation as a ruthless negotiator preceded his artificial smile. Next to him stood Elizabeth, arms crossed, a triumphant look in her eyes. "Claire, sit down," Anthony ordered, his voice regaining the authoritative tone of the CEO he had been for 20 years. "We need to discuss an important matter." Claire sat in the leather armchair, her back straight, her hands calmly resting on her knees. She wore a simple emerald-green dress that her mother had made for her 18th birthday, still refusing to buy the designer clothes Anthony made available to her. "I've asked Mr. Lambert to prepare a prenuptial agreement," Anthony continued, avoiding her gaze. "It's a simple formality to protect the family's interests," Elizabeth chimed in, unable to contain her satisfaction. "To be more precise, I was the one who requested it. It's important that things are clear from the start. In case of divorce, you can only claim a defined sum, with no rights to the company's properties or investments." Mr. Lambert pushed a thick document in front of Claire. "Take your time to read it, Mrs. Richards. It's quite standard for situations like yours." The silence that followed was as dense as the morning fog on the Hudson. Anthony stared fixedly out the window, his tense profile betraying his discomfort. Elizabeth watched Claire like a hawk eyeing its prey. Claire took the document, flipped through it quickly, then looked up. Her gaze expressed neither anger nor hurt, but a kind of quiet understanding that destabilized Anthony, far more than an outburst of tears would have. "Where do I sign?" she asked simply. Mr. Lambert, taken aback, stammered, "But you should take time to read it carefully, perhaps consult your own lawyer." "That won't be necessary," Claire replied, taking a pen. "However, I would like to add a clause, if you'll allow it." Elizabeth narrowed her eyes with suspicion. "What clause?" "In case of separation, I will claim nothing but my clothes and my personal books, not even the gifts Anthony may have given me." A stunned silence filled the room. Mr. Lambert looked at Elizabeth, then Anthony, seeking direction. "Why?" Anthony's question came out as a strangled whisper. Claire turned to him, her brown eyes reflecting a wisdom that seemed to far surpass her 21 years. "Because I never wanted your money, Anthony. I simply wanted the man I saw stay to listen to the street musician to the end of the piece instead of just passing by. I wanted the man who still cries over his children though they are adults. I wanted the man, not the millionaire." She signed the document with a fluid gesture, then handwrote her additional clause before initialing. Elizabeth was left speechless for the first time in her life, her carefully constructed world of accusations and distrust suddenly showing a crack. That evening, Anthony found Claire in the small garden of the townhouse, watering the rose bushes she had planted upon her arrival. He approached her, uncomfortable, hands in pockets like a schoolboy caught at fault. "I'm sorry about today," he finally said. "I shouldn't have allowed it." Claire continued watering the roses, their fragrance intensifying in the evening air. "You don't trust me, Anthony. That's normal. Trust isn't bought, it's earned." She set down the watering can and turned to him, her face illuminated by the last light of day. "One day, you'll understand that some things can't be measured by contracts or clauses. Love is one of them." Anthony wanted to take her in his arms, but something, perhaps shame, perhaps fear, held back his gesture. Claire noticed and smiled gently. "The time will come, Anthony. The time will come." The second obstacle arose 3 weeks before the grand wedding planned at St. Patrick's Cathedral. Anthony, consumed by persistent doubts and the continuous insinuations of his entourage, gave in to his paranoia. In his study with its heavy velvet curtains, he summoned Bernard Morris, a former police commissioner, turned private detective whose methods were as effective as they were discreet. "I want to know everything about her," Anthony ordered, sliding a thick envelope toward the man with the impassive face. "Her past, her relationships, her debts, her secrets, everything." Bernard Morris didn't blink, accustomed to the requests of the wealthy tormented by distrust. "Of course, Mr. Richards, we'll be thorough." Anthony immediately felt dirty, as if the words spoken had left an oily trace on his skin. But it was too late to turn back. During the days that followed, Claire noticed the discreet cars that followed her, the strangers who had coffee at the same places she did, the calls to former neighbors and friends. She said nothing, continuing her routine. Visits to the charity hospital, long walks in Central Park, daily calls to her parents. One morning, as she read quietly on the terrace, she spotted Charles, Anthony's younger son, observing her from the entrance. At 19, Charles was the most reserved of the Richards children. A brilliant medical student, he already carried that gravity particular to those who deal with suffering daily. "You can join me if you'd like," Claire offered without looking up from her book, instead of watching me like a laboratory specimen. Charles advanced, surprised at having been noticed, and sat stiffly in the chair across from her. "What are you reading?" he asked, seeking a way to start the conversation. Claire showed him the worn cover, To Kill a Mockingbird. It was my grandmother's favorite book. She said that Harper Lee understood that true poverty isn't in the pockets, but in souls that have forgotten compassion. Charles let out a short laugh, almost contemptuous. "Novel philosophy, reality is more pragmatic." "Really?" Claire gently closed her book. "And what is this reality according to you? That everyone has a price, that people do what's in their interest. That altruism is a facade." Claire observed him for a moment, seeing behind the cynicism the wound of a child who had seen his world collapse with his parents' divorce. "Did your father hire you as a junior detective, or are you doing this just for your own account?" she suddenly asked, a mischievous smile on her lips. Charles blushed violently. "I don't know what you're talking about. The men who have been following me for a week, I noticed them from the first day. Your father wants to know if I'm hiding something." Silence fell between them, heavy and accusatory. Then, against all expectations, Charles let out a small laugh, more genuine this time. "You're more observant than I thought. When you grow up in Brooklyn, you learn to spot pickpockets before they spot your wallet," Claire responded with a wink. A week later, the substantial report arrived on Anthony's desk in a sealed envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he opened it. What he discovered left him stunned. Claire had debts, not her own, but those of needy neighbors she helped in silence. She gave half of her modest salary to families in difficulty. Thank-you letters from elderly people she visited regularly testified to a discreet and constant generosity. The report detailed how she had rejected the advances of wealthy men in the past, how she had worked hard to help her parents despite offers of an easier life. It mentioned her impeccable reputation in the neighborhood, where she was known for her loyalty and honesty. Anthony closed the file, overcome by a feeling of deep shame. He had sought proof that she was an opportunist, and he had found the portrait of a modern saint. When Claire entered his study that evening unannounced, Anthony couldn't meet her gaze. "Did you find what you were looking for?" she asked gently, indicating the file on his desk. "How did you know? Love makes one observant, Anthony, and I love you enough to see your fear." She came closer and placed a hand on his cheek, rough with stubble. "You wanted proof that I didn't love you for your money, but you were looking in the wrong place. The proof isn't in my past, it's in our future. In the days, months, and years I'll stay by your side, whether you're rich or poor, powerful or fallen." Anthony felt something break within him. Not his heart, but the armor that had surrounded it for so long. "I don't deserve you," he whispered. Claire smiled, that smile that lit up her face and warmed the room better than the summer sun. "Love isn't a matter of deserving, Anthony. It's a matter of choosing, and I've chosen you." "Saint." Patrick's cathedral gleamed under the spring sun, its stained glass windows projecting colourful kaleidoscopes onto the elegant guests filling the nave. New York's aristocracy, finance magnates and celebrities had crowded in to witness the wedding that had fueled conversations for months. In a small side room, Claire stood before an antique mirror, dressed in a simple white lace gown. She had refused the diamonds and pearls Anthony had brought from the finest jewellers, preferring to wear only her grandmother's silver brooch. Sarah, her mother, adjusted the veil on her black hair, her skilled embroiderer's fingers trembling slightly with emotion. "Are you sure, my daughter?" she asked softly. "This world, it's not ours." Claire turned to her mother, taking her hands in her own. "Love has no social class, Mum. And Anthony's world needs our simplicity as much as we sometimes need to dream." Frank, her father, then entered, imposing in his borrowed suit, his woodworker's hands uncomfortably clean for the occasion. "It's time, my little one," he announced, his gruff voice betraying his emotion. In the cathedral, Anthony waited before the altar, flanked by his childhood friend as best man. His 3 children sat in the front row, their expressions ranging from Elizabeth's barely veiled hostility to Charles's cautious curiosity and Michael's manifest boredom, the youngest. The first notes of the organ resounded under the centuries-old vaults, and a murmur ran through the assembly when Claire appeared on her father's arm. Her simplicity contrasted violently with the ostentatious luxury of the guests, but she emanated a natural grace that captivated even the most cynical. When she joined Anthony before the altar, the old cardinal began the ceremony. Everything proceeded according to tradition until the moment of the vows. When it was her turn to speak, Claire did not recite the agreed-upon words. She looked Anthony straight in the eyes and spoke in a clear voice that resonated to the back of the cathedral. "I do not promise you obedience, Anthony, because true love does not command. I do not promise to follow you blindly, because true love walks side by side. I promise you my truth, even when it will be difficult to hear. I promise you my support, not in the shadow, but in the light of my own convictions." A stunned murmur ran through the assembly. These vows were not what was expected from a young woman marrying a powerful man. "I love you," Claire continued, "not for what you possess, but for the man I saw crying in secret in Central Park, holding the photo of your children. I love you for the way you treat Mrs. Collins, who cleans your office with respect. I love you for that gesture, the first that won my heart, seeing you put money in a street musician's hat and stay to listen to the entire piece, instead of simply passing by." Unexpected tears appeared in Anthony's eyes, overwhelmed by this public declaration that revealed intimate moments he believed were secret. "I promise to be by your side in wealth as in poverty, not because it's the consecrated formula, but because I know that true wealth is not in vaults, but in hearts that understand each other." When it was Anthony's turn, he hesitated, tearing up the paper where his prepared vows were written. For the first time in his career, the great Anthony Richards improvised, letting his heart speak before a stunned assembly. "Claire, you have seen in me what I had forgotten I was. Behind the bank accounts and properties you found the man I thought was lost. I cannot promise to be perfect. My children can testify that I never have been." A nervous laugh ran through the audience. "But I promise to try each day to be worthy of this love that you offer me so generously." The rings were exchanged, and when the cardinal declared them husband and wife, Anthony kissed Claire with a tenderness that surprised those who knew him as a ruthless negotiator. As they exited the cathedral, descending the steps under a shower of rose petals, Anthony squeezed Claire's hand in his own. "You shocked all of New York with your vows," he murmured. Claire smiled, her gaze embracing the elegant crowd that observed them with a mixture of fascination and perplexity. "Perhaps New York needed to be shaken up a bit," she replied. "And you too, Anthony Richards." The grand wedding ball was held in the gardens of the Plaza Hotel, under white silk tents illuminated by thousands of crystalline fireflies. The orchestra played classic waltzes, while guests in evening wear twirled on the dance floor, or clustered in small groups to exchange the latest New York gossip. Claire, in her simple wedding dress, stood apart from the crowd, observing this world that was now hers, with a mixture of curiosity and amusement. Anthony was busy receiving congratulations from business partners and influential politicians, his CEO mask perfectly in place. "So, how does one find their role as a modern Cinderella?" The sarcastic voice made Claire turn around. Teresa Richards, Anthony's ex-wife, stood before her, sublime in a blood-red designer gown. At 40, she radiated that confidence that can only be possessed by women who have had everything and lost everything, only to rebuild themselves. "Mrs. Richards," Claire greeted politely. "Call me Teresa, dear. After all, we now share a man." Her smile was as sharp as a knife. "Although in my case, it's only his name and child support for our children." Claire was not destabilized. "I'm happy to finally meet you. Anthony rarely speaks of you, but your children are extraordinary. You must be very proud." Teresa arched a perfectly plucked eyebrow, surprised by this response devoid of hostility. "They are what I hold most precious," she admitted, "and also the reason I came to talk to you. Don't hurt them." "That's not my intention," Claire responded with gentleness. "I'm not trying to replace their mother." "No, of course not. You're younger than Elizabeth. You could be their friend or perhaps their little sister." The barb was evident, but Claire smiled. "Age is rarely an indicator of wisdom or goodness, isn't it? Otherwise we would live in a very different world." Teresa studied her more carefully, looking for the flaw or the hidden insult behind this calm response. Finding none, she changed tactics. "You know he'll break your heart, don't you? Anthony is incapable of trust, incapable of truly loving someone more than his own ambition. You seem to know him well. 15 years of marriage, dear. You end up knowing the shadows of the man you married." Claire looked at Anthony through the crowd. He was laughing at a joke, but his eyes remained vigilant, calculating. "Perhaps," she said softly. "The shadows exist, because no one has yet brought enough light." Teresa let out a surprised laugh, almost genuine. "You're either naive or terribly arrogant. I don't know which is more dangerous. Or perhaps simply optimistic," Claire replied. "Anthony isn't perfect, and I don't expect him to be, but he deserves a chance to be more than what the world expects of him." Before Teresa could respond, Michael, Anthony's youngest son, approached them. At 17, he was the image of his father at the same age, same determined jaw, same penetrating eyes, but with a vulnerability that years had erased in Anthony. "Mum, Dad is looking for you," he said, casting a wary glance at Claire. "Really? How unusual," Teresa responded with an ironic smile. "I'll leave you to your party, Claire. Enjoy this honeymoon, while it lasts." After her departure, Michael remained standing in front of Claire, visibly uncomfortable. "You don't have to stay with me," Claire said kindly. "I understand that this situation is strange for you." Michael shrugged with that studied nonchalance of teenagers. "Why did you marry him?" "Really?" The direct question surprised Claire, but she saw in it an opening she had not hoped for so soon. "Because beneath all his defenses, your father is a man who has forgotten how to be loved without conditions, and I've always had a weakness for complicated puzzles." Michael scrutinized her, looking for the lie or manipulation. "He's hard, you know, even with us, especially with us sometimes. Hardness is often armor for those who have been hurt," Claire replied. Then, seeing Michael's skeptical expression, she added, "But that's not an excuse. I hope that with time he'll learn to put down this armor, at least with those he loves." Michael seemed to consider her words, then murmured almost despite himself, "I'd like to see that." Later in the evening, as Claire danced with her father Frank, she spotted Anthony watching the scene. For a brief instant, his mask fell, revealing an expression of such vulnerability, such desire for belonging, that Claire felt her heart tighten. In that furtive glance, she saw the full extent of the challenge awaiting her, helping this man rediscover his own humanity. "You've chosen a difficult path, my daughter," murmured Frank, who had followed her gaze. "Rebuilding what is broken requires more courage than building anew." "I know, Dad," she replied, squeezing his calloused hand. "But the most precious things are often those for which we've had to fight." 3 months after the wedding, Anthony organized a family dinner in his Upper East Side townhouse. The tension was palpable around the massive oak table where ministers and heads of state had dined. Claire had insisted on preparing the meal herself, a pot roast whose recipe came from her grandmother, much to the dismay of the starred chef usually employed by the household. Elizabeth picked at her food with a disdainful grimace, while Michael ate with the voracious appetite proper to his age. Charles, unusually silent even for him, seemed lost in his thoughts. Anthony awkwardly attempted to animate the conversation, moving from sports results to the latest exhibitions in the city. "It's delicious," Michael finally said, breaking an embarrassing silence. "You really cook well." Claire smiled at him gratefully. "Thank you, Michael. It's my grandmother's recipe. She always said that food is the only form of love you can taste." Elizabeth rolled her eyes but refrained from any sharp comments, a notable improvement. "So, Charles," Anthony intervened, "how's your internship at the hospital going?" Charles lifted his head abruptly, as if torn from a deep reverie. "Fine," he responded laconically before adding, almost despite himself, "Well, not exactly." All eyes turned to him, surprised by this unexpected confession. "What's happening?" Anthony asked, his brow furrowing with concern. Charles set down his fork, his usually impassive face betraying an unusual tension. "I'm facing a disciplinary procedure at the university, an accusation of plagiarism for a research article." A stunned silence fell over the table. "That's ridiculous," exclaimed Anthony, his face reddening with anger. "Who dares accuse you?" "I'll call the dean immediately." "It's not that simple, Father," Charles replied with evident bitterness. "Professor Landon has apparently convincing evidence. Passages of my article are identical to works published last year. Did you plagiarize?" The direct question came from Claire, who was watching Charles carefully. The others looked at her, shocked by this frank intervention. Charles held her gaze for a long moment before responding. "No, I cited all my sources. But some of my notes may have been mixed up. I worked on this article during my night shifts at the hospital. I was exhausted." "Why didn't you say anything?" asked Elizabeth, the anger in her voice masking her concern. Charles shrugged. "What could you have done? Even with Father's name and influence, the university values its independence. And an accusation of plagiarism, even refuted, always leaves a shadow on a medical career." Anthony rose abruptly. "I won't let this happen. I'll hire the best lawyers, speak to the hospital administrators." "No," Charles interrupted him. "That's exactly what I don't want. Using your money and influence to smother the matter would only confirm what everyone already thinks, that the Richards can buy their way out of any problem." Claire observed the scene in silence, noting the complex family dynamics playing out before her. Anthony seeking to solve problems with his power, Charles fighting for his independence, Elizabeth oscillating between rivalry and fraternal protection. The next day, without telling anyone, Claire discreetly sold the only valuable jewelry she owned, a set of earrings and a necklace from her grandmother, family heirlooms she had planned to pass on to her own children one day. With the money, she contacted Mr. Ross, a discreet but brilliant lawyer specializing in university law, whom she had met during her volunteer activities. A week later, Charles discovered the truth when he accidentally found the receipt from the jeweler on Fifth Avenue. He immediately went to the small studio Claire had set up in the attic, where she spent hours embroidering silk scarves as her mother had taught her. "Why did you do that?" he asked from the doorway, brandishing the receipt. "I didn't ask you for anything." Claire continued her embroidery, her face serene despite the confrontation. "One doesn't ask family for help, Charles. One simply offers it." "We're not a family," he replied, but his voice lacked conviction. Claire finally looked up at him. "Family isn't always a matter of blood. Sometimes it's a matter of choice. I chose your father, but that means I chose all three of you as well." Charles advanced into the room, uncomfortable. "They were your family jewels." "Yes. You were keeping them for your own children." "Objects are just objects, Charles. What matters are people and principles." The young man sat heavily on a stool, visibly troubled. "I don't understand. You had no reason to do this. We haven't exactly welcomed you with open arms." Claire smiled, that bright smile that seemed to light up even the darkest corners. "Family protects family, regardless of blood or age." She paused, then added softly, "Mr. Ross is confident. Your case is solid. You're a brilliant doctor, Charles. The world needs doctors who care as much as you do." That evening, Charles sought out his father in his study, and for the first time in a long time, they had an honest conversation. Anthony learned of Claire's discreet intervention and remained silent for a long time after his son's departure. In the silence of the New York night, as the city lights cast moving shadows on the walls, Anthony realized that something was beginning to change in his home. A subtle warmth was infiltrating the cracks of this broken family, brought by a young woman from Brooklyn who understood better than anyone the value of things that cannot be bought. 6 months after the wedding, Anthony Richards's world collapsed like a house of cards in a New York storm. The financial crisis that had been brewing for months suddenly exploded, shaking the markets and decimating fortunes built on decades of prudent calculations. Anthony spent days and nights in his study, his bloodshot eyes fixed on screens displaying increasingly alarming figures. Companies that had seemed as solid as the Empire State Building collapsed in hours. Investments considered safe evaporated like morning mist on the Hudson. "We need to sell the properties in the Hamptons," he announced during a crisis meeting with his advisors. His voice, usually firm and authoritative, betrayed a crushing fatigue. "And the shares in the Napa Valley vineyards." "Mr. Richards," his financial director cautiously intervened, "even with these sales, the losses are considerable, nearly half of your fortune." Anthony raised a hand to interrupt him. "I know. Prepare the necessary documents." When the advisors left the room, Anthony remained alone, contemplating through the window the New York rooftops stretching under the grey November sky. He felt strangely empty, as if a part of himself was disappearing with these abstract figures on computer screens. The door opened softly, and Claire entered, carrying a tray with a bottle of champagne and homemade cookies. She set it on the desk, cluttered with documents, and sat quietly beside Anthony on the floor, without saying a word. "You've heard," he finally stated. It wasn't a question. "Yes. Half of my fortune. Maybe more before it's all over." Claire took his hand, her slender fingers intertwining with his. "And so?" Anthony looked at her, incredulous. "And so?" "Claire, you don't understand. It's millions of dollars. The properties, the cars, the artworks, this entire lifestyle. Do you love me, Anthony?" The question caught him off guard. "Of course I love you. What does that have to do with—" "And your children, do you love them?" "More than anything." "Then we have the essentials." Claire smiled, squeezing his hand tighter. "The rest is just scenery." Anthony shook his head, frustrated by what he perceived as naivety. "It's not that simple. We won't be able to live like before. No private jet, no luxury vacations, no—" "Anthony," Claire gently interrupted him, "I grew up in a house where the greatest luxury was a hot meal on the table each evening and laughter shared around that table. It was enough, more than enough." She rose and opened the champagne bottle, filling 2 flutes. "My mother always says that we celebrate victories, but we also toast to defeats, because they remind us of what truly matters." She handed him a flute, then raised her own. "To us, to our family, to what cannot be lost on the stock market." Anthony took the flute but didn't drink immediately. "What are we going to do?" Claire took a deep breath. Then, in a firm voice that her young age made even more remarkable, she made a proposal that left him stunned. "We'll move into the house in Brooklyn where I grew up. My parents have an apartment above their workshop now. The house is empty. It's simple, but the view of the Manhattan skyline is magnificent at dawn. I'll go back to work, perhaps at the charity hospital where we met. You could teach at NYU Stern, share your experience. Together, we'll rebuild our life, not with millions, but with love and honest work." Anthony stared at her, looking for signs of resentment or regret. He found only that unwavering purity, that quiet conviction that had attracted him from the beginning. "You're ready to give up everything?" "This house, the staff, the designer clothes," Claire laughed, a crystalline sound that seemed to illuminate the dark room. "I never wanted these things, Anthony. I accepted them because they were part of your life, but they don't define who we are." She sipped her champagne, then added with a wink, "Besides, I make better cookies than your starred chef. Try one." Anthony took one of the small golden treats and bit into it. The flavor suddenly reminded him of his childhood, before the fortune, before the crushing responsibilities, when happiness consisted of these simple little pleasures. "It's delicious," he admitted, feeling an unexpected emotion tighten his throat. What he didn't know was that Elizabeth was standing in the shadow of the hallway, an unwitting witness to this scene. The young woman felt something break in her chest, not from sadness, but as if a wall of ice was suddenly melting, releasing long-contained emotions. All her certainties about Claire's intentions, about fortune hunters and sordid interests, collapsed before the naked truth. This young woman, barely younger than herself, loved her father in a way that she herself, his own daughter, had not managed to demonstrate in recent years. She moved away silently, her cheeks wet with tears she had not shed since adolescence. 2 weeks later, the Richards family moved into the modest house in Brooklyn Heights. Nestled in a cobblestone street halfway up the hill, the building with its faded blue shutters offered an unparalleled view of the Manhattan skyline and the Brooklyn Bridge. The interior was simple but welcoming. Exposed beams, a creaking wooden staircase, walls in warm colors covered with family photos and framed watercolors. Anthony contemplated the master bedroom, 3 times smaller than his former dressing room, with a mixture of perplexity and fascination. A wrought-iron bed, a weathered wooden dresser, a small window with handmade lace curtains by Claire's mother. Nothing luxurious, nothing ostentatious, but strangely welcoming. "So you look like you're discovering an unknown species," Claire joked, joining him, carrying a box of books. Anthony smiled, embarrassed at having been caught in his contemplation. "It's different. Different good or different bad?" He thought for a moment. "Just different. I haven't lived in such an intimate space since my university years." Claire set down the box and embraced her husband by the waist. "You'll get used to it. And you'll discover that small spaces bring people closer. Physically, of course, but also emotionally." The most surprising thing was Elizabeth's reaction. She arrived the next day, not for a brief obligatory visit as Anthony expected, but with 2 suitcases and a determined air. "I'm moving in," she announced simply, facing the stunned Claire and her father. "My apartment near Columbia is too expensive now, and since we all have to tighten our belts." Claire exchanged a glance with Anthony, then smiled at her stepdaughter. "The room under the eaves is small, but it has the most beautiful view in the house. Come, I'll show you." As the 2 young women climbed the stairs, Anthony remained motionless in the small entryway, trying to understand this unexpected turnaround. The following days brought other surprises. Charles came to dinner almost every evening after his hospital shifts, often accompanied by Michael, who, after initial resistance, seemed increasingly comfortable in this new family dynamic. One evening, as Claire prepared a pot roast in the tiny kitchen, Anthony watched her, fascinated by the ease with which she moved in this confined space, peeling, cutting, tasting with a natural grace. "How do you do it?" he suddenly asked. Claire looked up from her carrots. "How do I do what?" "Adapt so easily. Transform this situation into something that seems almost normal, almost desirable." Claire wiped her hands on her apron and approached him. "It's not adaptation, Anthony. It's a return to basics, to the essential." She took his face in her hands, a gesture of an intimacy that would have been unthinkable a few months earlier. "Look around you. Tonight, your 3 children will be at the table with us. They laugh in this house, Anthony. They talk, they argue sometimes, but they are present. When was the last time that happened in your townhouse?" Anthony couldn't answer. The truth was that his children had never been so present, so engaged in his life, as since they had lost everything, or rather, as Anthony was beginning to understand, since they had left behind everything that wasn't essential. "I don't know how to lead this life," he admitted, with an honesty that was still difficult for him. Claire smiled, her eyes reflecting a wisdom that far surpassed her 21 years. "No one does, Anthony. We learn day by day. The only difference is that now you're learning to live rather than to possess." Dinner that evening was animated. Michael recounted his misadventures at the public high school, where he had enrolled after leaving his private institution. Elizabeth passionately debated a legal case with Charles, their disagreements tempered by a mutual respect that hadn't existed before. After the meal, as they drank inexpensive but delicious wine in mismatched glasses, Anthony realized he was laughing, not the controlled laugh he reserved for his business partner's jokes, but a deep, genuine laugh that came from the belly. Later that night, lying in the wrought-iron bed that creaked at the slightest movement, Anthony observed Claire sleeping beside him. The moonlight filtered through the lace curtains, drawing complex patterns on her skin. A truth struck him then with startling clarity. He had spent his life accumulating wealth to fill a void that only this simplicity had finally been able to fill. In this house with slightly cracked walls, creaking floors and windows that let in drafts, he felt more at home than in any of his luxurious properties. He gently caressed Claire's cheek, amazed by the transformation she had wrought, not in their material situation, but in their very souls. Winter settled over New York, wrapping Brooklyn in a white blanket that transformed the cobblestone streets into fairy tale paths. In the small house with blue shutters, life had found a new rhythm. Anthony had accepted a teaching position at NYU Stern, sharing his experience with students eager to understand both his successes and failures. Claire worked part-time at the charity hospital and dedicated the rest of her time to creating embroidered silk scarves that she sold in a boutique in Soho. One January morning, as frost drew arabesques on the windows, Charles arrived without warning, his usually impassive face animated by unusual energy. "I need to talk to you," he announced, depositing a thick folder on the kitchen table where Anthony and Claire were having coffee. "What's happening?" Anthony asked, intrigued by his son's barely contained excitement. Charles took a deep breath. "I've investigated the financial crisis that destroyed your company. It wasn't just the economic recession." He opened the folder and spread several documents on the table. There was sabotage, deliberate manipulation, and I believe I know who is responsible. Anthony examined the documents, his face darkening as he understood the implications. "Xavier Martin," he finally murmured. Claire observed the two men, feeling the tension rise in the small kitchen. "Who is Xavier Martin?" she asked softly. Anthony looked up, his eyes reflecting an old wound reopened. "My partner for 20 years, my friend. At least I thought he was." Charles resumed the explanation, his clinical voice barely masking his indignation. "He systematically diverted funds to accounts in the Cayman Islands while manipulating investments to maximize losses during the crisis. It wasn't bad luck, Father, it was calculated." A heavy silence filled the room. Anthony stared at the documents without really seeing them, his world tipping once more. Claire gently placed her hand on his. "What do you plan to do?" she asked. Anthony looked up, his hard gaze recalling the ruthless businessman he had been. "Destroy him, of course. Use these proofs to drag him to court, recover what can be recovered, and ensure that he can never again." He broke off, struck by the realization of what he was saying. Claire didn't speak, giving him the space needed to navigate his own emotions. "That's what I would have done before," he continued more calmly. "Revenge. Mutual destruction." Charles frowned, confused by this hesitation. "But it's the logical thing to do. He stole from you, betrayed you. These proofs are solid." Anthony looked around him. The small, warm kitchen, the chipped but beloved cups, the family photos recently hung on the walls. Then he looked at Claire, whose face expressed neither judgment nor expectation, just an attentive presence. "What if we used these proofs differently?" he finally said. "Not to destroy, but to rebuild. Not for revenge, but for justice." Claire smiled, immediately understanding where he was going with this. Charles, however, seemed perplexed. "What do you mean, Father?" Anthony stood up, a new energy animating him. "These proofs will allow us to recover some of the funds, that's certain, but instead of seeking to punish Xavier, we could use this situation to create something new, something that makes sense." The months that followed were dedicated to a meticulous legal battle. With the help of Elizabeth, who put her law studies at the service of the family cause, and Mr. Ross, who had already helped Charles, they built an irrefutable case. The confrontation with Xavier Martin took place not in a courtroom, but in a small cafe near Bryant Park. The 45-year-old man, with graying temples and an impeccable suit, paled upon seeing Anthony accompanied by Charles and Elizabeth. "We know everything," Anthony said simply, pushing a copy of the file toward his former friend. "Every transfer, every manipulation, every lie." Xavier quickly scanned the documents, his face progressively losing all color. "Anthony, I can explain—" "No need for explanations," Anthony interrupted him. "The facts speak for themselves. Here's what's going to happen. You will return the diverted funds with interest. In exchange, we won't take the case to court." Xavier stared at him, suspicious. "That's it? No revenge? No public destruction?" Anthony smiled, a smile that had nothing triumphant about it, just a quiet assurance. "I no longer need that, Xavier. I've discovered something far more precious than revenge." The recovery was slow but steady. A significant portion of the fortune was recovered over a year of tense negotiations. But something fundamental had changed. Anthony no longer wanted that old life. He had learned that waking up beside Claire in their small Brooklyn house was worth more than all the zeros in a bank account. One evening, as they enjoyed the small garden on their roof terrace where they grew herbs and a few tomatoes, Anthony took Claire's hand. "I've made a decision," he announced, his gaze more serene than Claire had ever seen it. "About the recovered money." Claire waited, feeling the importance of the moment. "I don't want to rebuild the empire. I want to build something new. Use these funds to develop the small artisanal businesses we've created with your parents. Create jobs here in Brooklyn. Fund the studies of talented young people who don't have the means to access the great schools. And perhaps," he hesitated for an instant, "build that medical clinic Charles has been talking about for months, where everyone would have access to dignified care." Claire felt tears come to her eyes, not of sadness, but of pride. The man she had married, hardened by years of distrust and unbridled ambition, had transformed into someone who understood the true meaning of wealth. "I'm proud of you," she whispered, squeezing his hand tighter. "So proud." Anthony looked toward the Manhattan skyline, majestic and glittering in the twilight sky of New York. "You know what's strange? I feel richer today, with a fraction of what I owned before than I ever have been." Claire smiled, her face illuminated by the last rays of the sun. "That's not strange at all. It's simply the difference between owning and belonging." Anthony meditated on these words, understanding for the first time the profound truth they contained. In his former life, he owned much but belonged to nothing and no one. Now, with almost nothing, he belonged. To this house, to this rebuilt family, to this community that was beginning to accept him, and above all, to Claire, whose unconditional love had transformed the ashes of his fortune into something infinitely more precious. Spring arrived in New York, transforming Brooklyn into an impressionist painting of vivid colors and intoxicating scents. The small cobblestone streets came alive with tourists and street musicians, while cafes brought out their tables to enjoy the first warm rays of the sun. In the house with blue shutters, a silent but profound transformation continued. Claire, with her skilled fingers and natural creativity, had developed her small embroidery activity into a flourishing workshop. What had begun as a few scarves sold in a Soho boutique had become a collection sought after by loyal clients who appreciated the craftsmanship and unique patterns inspired by the Brooklyn Bridge and Manhattan skyline. One morning, as she worked on a special commission, a wedding shawl adorned with cherry blossoms, Sarah, her mother, paid her a visit. At 46, Sarah retained that simple elegance that had always characterized the women in their family. Her hands, like Claire's, bore the delicate marks of decades spent handling needle and thread. "It's magnificent," Sarah commented, observing her daughter's work. "You've surpassed your teacher." Claire smiled, grateful for this rare compliment from her perfectionist mother. "I had good teaching." Sarah sat across from her, her gaze sweeping the small studio set up under the roof, with its natural light flooding the space through a skylight, and the shelves crumbling under spools of colorful threads and precious fabrics. "Your grandmother would be proud," she said softly. "She always said your hands were made to create beauty." Claire paused for a moment, moved by the evocation of her grandmother, this strong woman who had lived through hard times with dignity and who had transmitted so much wisdom to her. "I have an idea," Sarah suddenly announced. "A proposal, actually." Claire looked up, intrigued by her mother's unusually hesitant tone. "Frank and I have been talking. Our orders are increasing, both for my embroidery and for his furniture. We're short on space and hands. We thought, perhaps, that we could join forces, create something together, a real family business." Claire set down her work, surprised and touched by this proposal. "You mean you, Dad, Anthony, and me?" Sarah nodded. "Anthony has business experience, even if it was on a very different scale. Frank knows logistics better than anyone. You and I have the creativity and technique. Together, we could develop something truly unique." That evening, Claire shared the idea with Anthony. They were sitting on their small balcony, watching the sun set behind the Manhattan skyline, sharing a glass of wine and slices of bread with cheese, a simple ritual they had established since moving to Brooklyn. "What do you think?" Claire asked after explaining her mother's proposal. "Would it interest you? I know it's very different from what you did before." Anthony contemplated the city progressively lighting up, his eyes reflecting an inner peace he would never have believed possible a year ago. "You know what's ironic?" he finally said. "All my life, I've built financial empires, manipulated markets, orchestrated company mergers worth billions. And never, not once, did I create something with my own hands. He looked at his hands, still well-groomed but now marked by a few calluses from the work he did around the house, a novelty of which he took a strange pride. When Frank showed me how to sand that piece of furniture we restored together, when I felt the wood come alive under my fingers, I experienced more satisfaction than from any financial transaction. Claire smiled, touched by this confession. So you're interested? Anthony took her hand, bringing it to his lips in a tender gesture that had become natural between them. More than interested. I'm eager, building something real, with our hands and hearts, with your family that has become mine. What more beautiful project could I have? The following weeks were dedicated to developing this new project. They found a space to rent not far away, an old tailor's workshop with large windows and exposed brick walls. Anthony, applying his business experience on a more human scale, developed a realistic but ambitious financial plan. Sarah and Claire merged their collections, creating a distinctive visual identity that mixed American tradition and contemporary touches. Frank, with the occasional help of Michael, who was discovering an unexpected interest in woodworking, designed a layout that optimized the space while preserving the authenticity of the place. The day of the opening of Richards & Bennett, Brooklyn Artisans finally arrived. The workshop boutique was simply but tastefully decorated, showcasing Claire and Sarah's textile creations, as well as Frank's sculpted furniture. A small cafe area, Anthony's idea, invited clients to linger to discuss with the artisans, to observe the work in progress. Claire, standing at the entrance, watched with emotion as the first visitors explored the space. Brooklyn neighbors who came out of curiosity, some loyal customers, and even Elizabeth, who had invited influential friends from Columbia. It's a success, Anthony murmured, placing himself beside her and sliding an arm around her waist. Claire leaned her head on his shoulder. It's only the beginning. She observed her husband interacting with the visitors, passionately explaining the creation process, the importance of local craftsmanship, the stories behind each piece. This elegant man in a simple white shirt, sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms slightly tanned from outdoor work, had nothing left of the austere and distrustful CEO she had married. He had become authentic, present, alive. Later that day, as the sun was setting and the last customers were leaving, Claire found Anthony sitting alone in the workshop, contemplating a silk scarf she had embroidered, a complex pattern representing the Brooklyn Bridge seen from their window. "What are you thinking about?" she asked, sitting beside him. He looked up, a serene smile on his lips. "I'm thinking that I spent 40 years of my life chasing after something that was here all along. This feeling of creating something beautiful, useful, of being proud not of what I own, but of what I bring to the world." Claire took his hand, intertwining their fingers. "It's never too late to start over." Anthony looked around him. This simple space, full of promise. This new beginning that wasn't a defeat but a rebirth. "You know what?" he said, his eyes shining with a rare emotion. "For the first time in my adult life, I'm truly happy." Summer was at its peak in New York, transforming the city into a furnace of stone and asphalt. In the streets of Brooklyn, tourists in shorts and sandals sought the shade of plane trees, while regulars took refuge in the relative coolness of cafes with lowered awnings. The Richards & Bennett workshop boutique had quickly acquired a reputation that extended beyond the neighborhood. An article in a home decoration magazine had praised the authenticity of their creations and the unusual story of this blended family of artisans. Customers now came from all over New York, and even foreign tourists sought out the address of this boutique, which embodied, according to the journalist, the quintessence of the American spirit: resilience, elegance in simplicity, and craftsmanship passed down through generations. One particularly stifling Friday afternoon, as Claire was closing the boutique for a lunch break, Elizabeth appeared, her usually composed face betraying unusual agitation. "Do you have a moment?" she asked, her blue eyes, so similar to Anthony's, reflecting a rarely exposed vulnerability. "Of course," Claire replied, surprised but happy at this unexpected visit. "I was just about to make myself a sandwich. Will you join me?" They climbed to the small apartment located above the workshop, which Claire and Anthony sometimes used during long work days. The space was tiny but charming, with a terrace that offered a view of the surrounding rooftops. Claire prepared ham and cheese sandwiches, and served a carafe of fresh water infused with cucumber and mint. Elizabeth sat in silence, observing the efficient and graceful movements of her stepmother, who was almost her age. "I was accepted," Elizabeth finally announced as they settled on the shaded terrace, "for the internship at The Hague, the International Tribunal." Claire smiled broadly. "Elizabeth, that's wonderful. That was your dream, wasn't it?" "Congratulations." Elizabeth nodded, but her expression remained troubled. "I also received an offer from a major corporate law firm in Manhattan, the kind of position that opens all doors, well paid, prestigious." "And you don't know which to choose?" Claire guessed. "No, I know exactly what I want," Elizabeth replied with sudden firmness. "I want The Hague. I want to work for international justice, not to optimize profits for multinational corporations." Claire observed her carefully, understanding that the dilemma was more complex. "So, what's the problem?" Elizabeth took a deep breath. "I'm afraid of disappointing my father. All my life he's wanted me to take up the Richards business mantle. Even now with the workshop, I know he hopes I'll get involved, that I'll develop the commercial side." Claire remained silent for a moment, carefully considering her response. "Have you talked to your father about these offers?" "No," Elizabeth admitted. "I thought, maybe you could do it. Prepare the ground." Claire gently shook her head. "It's not my place to do that, Elizabeth. But I can tell you one thing. Your father is not the man he was a year ago. He's changed deeply." She leaned forward, her warm brown eyes fixed on Elizabeth's. "Do you know what he told me last night? That his greatest pride was not having built a financial empire, but having children who think for themselves, who have the courage of their convictions." Elizabeth seemed surprised. "He really said that?" "Really. And I think he sincerely meant it." A comfortable silence settled between them, punctuated only by the song of birds and the distant noises of the street below. Elizabeth absently bit into her sandwich, lost in her thoughts. "You know," she finally said, "for a long time I hated you." Claire smiled, not the least bit offended. "I know." "No, you don't understand. I hated you not because I thought you were a gold digger. Well, not just for that." Elizabeth gave a small, embarrassed laugh. "I hated you because from the first day you did what I never managed to do." "What's that?" "See my father. The real Anthony Richards, not the millionaire, not the CEO, but the man. Love him for himself, with his flaws, his wounds." Elizabeth lowered her eyes, her voice barely audible. "I spent my life trying to attract his attention, to get his approval. And you arrive, and in a few months you transform everything." Claire extended her hand, gently touching Elizabeth's arm. "Your father has always loved you, Elizabeth. He simply didn't know how to show it. Sometimes it takes an outside perspective to see what has always been there." Elizabeth raised her head, a new determination in her gaze. "I'll talk to him, tonight, about The Hague." "I think that's an excellent idea," Claire approved. That evening, Claire arranged to leave Anthony and Elizabeth alone in the small living room of the Brooklyn house. She pretended to visit her parents, giving them the necessary space for this important conversation. When she returned 3 hours later, she found Anthony and Elizabeth sitting side by side on the couch, sharing a bottle of red wine. Their eyes were slightly reddened, but they were laughing together, a sound so natural yet so rare in their past relationship. "Claire," Anthony exclaimed, seeing her, "come celebrate with us. Our daughter is off to conquer The Hague." The word "our" escaped neither Claire nor Elizabeth, who exchanged a knowing look. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Anthony took Claire in his arms with a moved tenderness. "How did you know?" he asked. "How did you know she needed my approval, and that I needed to give it to her?" Claire caressed his face, loving the new expression lines that marked the corners of his eyes. "Laugh lines, not worry lines." "I didn't do anything special, Anthony. I simply created a space where the truth could be spoken and heard. The rest you did yourselves." He kissed her gently, with a gratitude that surpassed words. "You know what I realized today? That true wealth isn't what you accumulate. It's what you're capable of letting go with love and trust." Claire smiled in the darkness, her heart overflowing with joy for this family that, slowly but surely, was healing its deepest wounds. Autumn arrived in New York in an explosion of copper and golden colors. The trees in Central Park, where it all began, adorned themselves with flaming hues, and cafe terraces equipped themselves with outdoor heaters to extend the open-air season. One late October morning, as a light fog still enveloped Brooklyn, Claire received a call from Charles. His voice, usually calm and measured, vibrated with unusual excitement. "I need to see you, you and Father. Today if possible. I have news." A few hours later, Charles arrived at the workshop boutique, accompanied to everyone's surprise by Michael, who had skipped classes for the occasion. The two brothers exchanged a knowing look before Charles spoke. "I received the results of my research project," he announced, his eyes shining with contained pride. "It's been accepted for publication in the Lancet, and the hospital has offered me an associate researcher position once my internship is completed." Exclamations of joy greeted this news, with Anthony embracing his son in an uncharacteristic hug that betrayed his emotion. Claire observed the scene with quiet happiness, remembering the wary and bitter young man Charles had been when she first met him. "That's not all," Michael intervened, unable to contain his impatience. "Tell them about the project." Charles smiled, an open smile that transformed his usually serious face. "My research project concerns access to healthcare in disadvantaged neighborhoods, and I thought, with the funds we've recovered," he hesitated, looking at Anthony, "we could create that clinic we talked about, here in Brooklyn, a place where everyone would have access to quality care, regardless of their financial situation." Anthony remained silent for a moment, visibly moved by this proposal that echoed his own transformation. "That's exactly what I hoped for," he finally said, "using this money not to rebuild what I lost, but to create something better, more useful." Claire approached, taking her husband's hand. "We could use the abandoned building at the end of the street, the one that used to be an old school. What if we combined ideas?" Michael suddenly proposed, his face animating with that youthful enthusiasm that had been so long suppressed by rebellion and resentment. "A clinic, yes, but also a training space for young people from the neighborhood. I've met so many guys at my high school who have potential but no opportunities." Charles looked at his younger brother with new appreciation. "That's an excellent idea. We could create a real community center." The discussion continued for hours, each contributing their ideas and skills. Anthony, applying his business experience to this social project, sketched a sustainable financing plan. Claire and Sarah imagined how to make the spaces welcoming and warm. Frank and Michael were already discussing the suitable furniture they could build. This creative effervescence was interrupted by Elizabeth's unexpected arrival, returning from The Hague for a short stay. When she learned of the project, her eyes lit up with a professional light. "You'll need a solid legal structure," she affirmed. "A foundation, probably, with public interest status." "I can take care of that." Anthony looked at his 3 children, amazed by the transformation that had occurred over the span of a year. Elizabeth, once so cold and calculating, now put her brilliant intelligence at the service of causes that passionate her. Charles, who had always hidden his sensitivity behind a mask of indifference, openly embraced his desire to help others. And Michael, the angry rebel, finally discovered how to channel his energy in a positive way. "I would never have imagined this," he murmured to Claire as they watched the siblings animatedly debate the project details. "Seeing them like this, united, passionate, engaged." Claire smiled, squeezing his hand in hers. "That's what happens when people feel seen, heard, valued for who they truly are, not for what's expected of them." That evening, the extended family, Anthony and Claire, Elizabeth, Charles and Michael, but also Sarah and Frank, and even Teresa, who had been invited in a spirit of reconciliation, gathered in the small garden of the Brooklyn house. Strings of lights had been suspended from the branches of the fig tree that dominated the space, and the table overflowed with simple but delicious dishes prepared by everyone. As the sun set over New York, tinting the sky with pink and gold, Anthony rose to propose a toast. He looked at each person around the table, those faces that had become his true wealth. "A year ago," he began, his voice laden with emotion, "I lost what I believed was everything. My fortune, my status, my power. I was convinced my life was over." He took Claire's hand, who stood by his side, radiant in a simple white dress embroidered by her own hands. "What I didn't know was that my true life was just beginning, thanks to this extraordinary woman who saw in me not what I possessed, but what I could become." Tears shone in his eyes, but for the first time in his adult life, Anthony Richards wasn't ashamed of them. These tears were the sign of a humanity rediscovered, of a heart that had learned to open again. Today I stand before you not as a rich man who has lost everything, but as an ordinary man who has gained everything, a united family, work that has meaning, and above all the ability to see beauty in simple things, to feel joy in shared moments, to love without fear and without conditions. He raised his glass, his hand slightly trembling, betraying his emotion. To Claire, who taught me that true wealth isn't counted in dollars. To my children, who gave me a second chance to be the father they deserved. And to all of you, who form this strange, imperfect but wonderfully real family. As glasses clinked in the New York twilight, Claire felt a deep peace wash over her. The path had been difficult, strewn with obstacles and doubts. But in this garden, under this fig tree witness to so many conversations, laughter and sometimes tears, she knew they had created something precious. A love that depended neither on age, nor fortune, nor conventions, but solely on this purity of heart that her grandmother had always taught her. A year later, on a mild spring evening, the Brooklyn house lit up for a special celebration. Claire and Anthony were celebrating their second wedding anniversary, not in a starred restaurant or a Manhattan palace, but in this modest home that had witnessed their greatest adventure, the rediscovery of what truly matters. The terrace had been transformed into a small fairy garden, with paper lanterns hung from the branches of the fig tree and bouquets of wildflowers adorning the wooden table. Sarah and Frank had brought their antique record player, which softly played songs by Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald, those timeless voices that embodied the soul of America. The guests arrived one by one, each bringing not extravagant gifts, but personal contributions to the evening. Elizabeth, returned from The Hague for the occasion, had prepared a photo album retracing this extraordinary year. Charles brought a bottle of wine from a small producer he had discovered during a rare escape from the hospital. Michael had carved with his own hands, under Frank's patient guidance, 2 cherry wood wedding bands, a symbolic gift to replace the solid gold rings Anthony had chosen during their wedding, which Claire had never truly liked. Even Teresa was present, bringing an apple pie made according to her own grandmother's recipe, a gesture of reconciliation worth all the speeches. The dinner was simple but delicious. A pot roast prepared collectively, crusty bread bought from the corner bakery, and aged cheeses selected by old Mr. Lewis, the cheesemonger who had become a regular at their boutique workshop. After the meal, as night gently wrapped around Brooklyn and the city lights began to twinkle below, Anthony took Claire by the hand and led her to the center of the terrace. "I have a surprise for you," he murmured in her ear. With a gesture, he asked Michael to change the record on the player. The first notes of a waltz rose in the evening air, "The Way You Look Tonight," this song that Claire often hummed while working, without even realizing it. Anthony placed a hand on Claire's waist, and with a grace she didn't know he possessed, led her into a slow waltz. "When did you learn to dance?" she asked, surprised and moved. Anthony smiled, that sincere smile that had replaced the controlled smirk of the businessman. "I took lessons, in secret, with Mrs. Wilson, from the 3rd floor." Claire laughed, imagining her 43-year-old husband, former titan of finance, patiently learning dance steps with their 70-year-old neighbor, a former Broadway dancer. "Why?" she asked simply. "Because I wanted to give you something money can't buy. A moment, a memory. A dance under the stars of New York, in this garden that has become our refuge." Claire felt tears come to her eyes, tears of pure joy, unmixed. "You know," Anthony said as he gently twirled her, "2 years ago, when I lost my fortune, I thought I had lost everything. I couldn't understand your serenity, your almost joyful acceptance of our new situation. The music enveloped them, creating a bubble of intimacy, despite the presence of guests who watched them with tender smiles. Now I understand," he continued. "You knew what took me so long to learn, that true luxury isn't in the things we own, but in the moments we share, in the ability to be fully present, to feel each instant in its totality." Claire nestled against him, breathing in his familiar scent, a mix of sandalwood, coffee, and that indefinable essence that was simply Anthony. "I love you," she whispered, "not for what you were or what you might become, but for who you are here and now." Around them, family and friends spontaneously began to dance as well, Sarah and Frank, with the complicity of couples who have traversed decades together. Elizabeth and a young lawyer she had met at The Hague. Charles and a hospital intern he had been discreetly seeing for several months. Michael and his high school girlfriend, awkward but enthusiastic. Even Teresa accepted the invitation to dance from an artist neighbor, her eyes reflecting a new peace, an acceptance of the past that opened the door to a more serene future. Later in the evening, as conversations continued softly and the city below lit up with 1,000 lights, Claire and Anthony isolated themselves for a moment on the small balcony that overlooked the street. "Look," said Claire, pointing to a particularly bright star above the Manhattan skyline. "My grandmother always said that when a star shines with such clarity, it's reminding us of an essential truth." Anthony followed her gaze, appreciating this moment of calm after the animation of the evening. "And what is this truth?" Claire turned to him, taking his face in her hands, this face she had seen transform over the months, the worry lines replaced by laugh lines, the permanent tension giving way to a new serenity. "That true love isn't a passive feeling, but an active choice we renew each day. That life isn't measured by the number of breaths we take, but by the moments that take our breath away, and that sometimes we must lose everything to discover what we would never have found otherwise." Anthony kissed her gently with a tenderness that contained all the gratitude he could never fully express in words. "You've transformed my ashes into gold," he murmured against her lips. Claire smiled, caressing his rough cheek. "No, my love. I simply blew on the embers to reveal the gold that had always been there." They remained thus for a long moment, embraced under the starry New York sky, conscious of the rarity and preciousness of this instant. In the house behind them, the laughter and conversations created the perfect soundtrack for this living tableau. A blended family, imperfect but authentic, united not by obligation or convention, but by a choice renewed each day. Claire thought of the 21-year-old woman she had been, entering with apprehension this cathedral to marry a man all of New York, considered cold and calculating. She thought of the obstacles they had overcome, the prejudices they had defied, the certainties they had abandoned. The path had not been easy, but each difficulty had brought them a little closer. Each trial had revealed a new facet of their love. And now, in this simple Brooklyn house with its unparalleled view of the most beautiful city in the world, they had found something all of Anthony's fortune could never have bought. A home, in the deepest and truest sense of the term. "To us," said Anthony, raising his glass one last time toward the stars. "To us," Claire responded, her smile reflecting all the light of the New York night, and to the purity of hearts that have learned to break in order to better rebuild themselves, together.